Welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be speaking today with Maria Rosa Brea-Spahn, and you can tell me, Maria, whether I said that correctly or not, who is the lead author of the paper, Where Do You Anchor Your Beliefs? An Invitation to Interrogate Dominant Ideologies of Language and Languaging in Speech-Language Pathology. So welcome, Maria, and thank you for speaking with me today about your paper.
Thank you for having me.
So we're really pleased to be making this cross-time and difference connection. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands I'm joining from today. And I'm joining from the lands of the Kumbameri people of the Yugambeh Nation here in the continent of Australia. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including any who may be listening to this conversation. So to tell you a little bit about Maria, I did send the bio around to the group, but I'm going to read that again for you. Maria is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at NYU in the United States. She is a teacher scholar whose work has been centred at the intersection of multilingualism and disability. Her classroom and community collaborations focus on researching the impact of standardised linguistic ideologies in speech-language practices, sustaining variability in languaging in the classroom, and co-envisioning a path for linguistic liberation through art. So, Maria, before I tell you what I felt about the paper, is there anything that you wanted to add or say before we go into the discussion of the paper?
No, well, first, thank you for having me. It's always a joy to be sharing space with you, Sam. And thank you to everyone who's listening and who might provide feedback on that paper that is actually very dear to my own development. The only edit I would provide to the bio is that I just was promoted to full clinical professor a couple of weeks ago. So yes.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Here at NYU. So yes, you know.
Excellent. Oh, you'll have to update that written bio now.
I will.
Well done. It's a lot of work in academia to, to get anywhere. So yeah, that's amazing news. So with the paper, yeah, I've got so much highlighting in here because there's so many points, and I learned, a lot from this. And yeah, that's what I guess I wanted to share first of all, that there's so much in the paper, that there's a lot to reflect on and a lot to absorb over time. Like, that's the other thing I was thinking. I think it'll take me time to take some of this in. But what I really liked was that I think, you take your reader on a journey, and, you teach us about, and you give us definitions, which is really helpful, because I think sometimes people feel or might recognise that there are things that need to change, but they don't have the tools for understanding what it is or doing anything about it. So I really liked that, you taught us about what ideology is, what hegemony is, how these underpin speech pathology and the impact that it has on people that we're supposedly trying to help. And I really liked the quote, the mission of SLPs is to help individuals achieve their human right to communicate. To this end, we may wonder, can our tools be helpful without harming? And I really like that, because it sort of boils everything down to, can we think about this is what we're actually supposed to be doing, and are we doing that in the best way? So in terms of the paper itself, yeah, I also enjoyed the metaphor for the journey, and especially the compass to support that taking a critical inquiry stance. So naming, disrupting, reframing, reflecting and acting. And then the fact that you took us through a practical example of what that might look like was really helpful. And also that you ended with a vision for what we could collectively achieve through that consciousness raising and through shifting our critical stances and collectively bringing about institutional change. So it was quite a journey and quite a lot, but I thought you did it in a really logical and systematic way that, helped me to understand some of these big concepts. So thank you for that. And for anyone who's watching this who has yet to read the paper, I'd definitely encourage you to read it before or after, whether or not you're attending the meeting. So to begin with, Maria, what led you, I can see a lot, well, it feels like when I read it, a lot went into this because it's a lot of concepts and a lot of trying to express those things clearly. And I was wondering what led you to write this paper?
What a great question. Well, thank you for giving me your take on it as well, or your perspective in it. You know, I think that paper represents my own epistemological journey over the last 7 years or so since I came to NYU. But I think, you know, part of the reason why that paper was born was because during 2020, until about 2022, while we were teaching remotely, I met Dr. Clara Bowler on what used to be Twitter.
Yes.
And we became fast friends, but the kind of friends who would meet every Friday to have conversations about each other's fields. So Clara is a sociolinguist. She's Brazilian. So she had a lot of the Paulo Freire's, you know, perspectives. I have embodied a lot of the Freirean ways of being in my classroom communities, but never had quite braided that in my scholarship. So the paper itself is sort of an encapsulation of what our regular Friday meetings were about. And so that's one reason behind where the paper came. The other place of its birth was I'm always very curious, and I read a lot outside of our field. I talk about myself as a promiscuous learner, a promiscuous epistemologist, and I'm very happy to embody that promiscuity in my learning. So part of it came as almost like an opportunity an invitation to integrate or braid all these strands of all these you know, articles, scholarship that was very different from what my upbringing was as an academic. And then I would say the third reason why that paper was born, and then there's many reasons, right? Because like you said, the paper itself kind of contains, we took you on a journey, which was our journey. But the third reason is I take pause sometimes when I read certain papers or scholarship, and I think about, I'm very reflective. So I started asking myself questions. It's like, have we ever questioned ourselves? Right? That there's a lot of research out there, if you go into the educational literature, that looks at teacher belief systems. And even some of this work on ideologies comes out of linguistics, you know, critical applied linguistics, but also like critical educational studies or critical disability studies. There is a lot of that sort of unearthing of the isms in the context of beliefs, right? As beliefs that anchor us.
Yeah.
But we've never seen work like that done in SLP, in speech-language pathology or speech-language therapy. So I became curious about it, partly because most of the studies that have been done that actually question beliefs are framed in such a way that the question is, do we feel prepared, quote unquote, to deal with people who may be different from us? And disability is not even questioned. Like, it's never about disability. It's always about people who may speak different languages, right? Quote unquote, different languages. And again, that is a very much a westernized, you know, English-centric, monoglot perspective. And so that curiosity ignited this need to like, okay, well, if we never question what the beliefs are, and then I had started reading a lot about ideologies, however you want to say it, say the word, what is it, you know, how is it that a field that actually centers language and its need, how is it that field does not center the criticality of what language is? And again, I have done that journey as a human being, as a bilingual learner in the United States, because I arrived here as an immigrant at the age of 17. I learned English as an adult here. I questioned and assimilated into a lot of the ways of languaging, but I didn't have that liberatory stance or that way of looking at language as something that is also part of who I am. And when I started reading literature that actually centered that way of looking at language as something that breathes inside of us, as something that is not just a set of structures, it's not that and notice I said that it's not just, because it's not that I'm saying that any of those definitions are wrong by themselves. Beliefs by themselves, ideas by themselves are not neither good nor bad. They're just what they are. Once we attribute a hierarchy to them, then we are potentially impacting how we see ourselves and how the people we're engaging with also see themselves. And it's very complex how that mechanism works, right? Like we are still sort of figuring out, like, how is it that these beliefs become entrenched as hegemonies, right? But I think that for me, it became sort of like, here, I'm going to crack open this door, kind of like Alice in Wonderland, right? I'm going to open it and I'm going to go on this adventure and see what can we find through it. And what's fascinating about it is, like, now I'm using that work in my classrooms too, and then to see like what pre-service speech language therapists have resistance to, also what they're more open or porous or willing to like engage with, or where they are where they're like, you know, absolutely not, I can't even think about it in that way because I'm going to go at it in a way that makes sense to me, and the way that makes sense to me is the positivist way that quantifies or that helps me make sure that I'm, you know, labeling a disorder, quote unquote, versus labeling a difference, quote unquote. Right? It's what we're taught.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So many things that you said are so interesting. And I think also, as you say, I think what's really nice about this is taking that critical inquiry, because as you say, we just kind of, as speech pathology students, go through the learning and the degree without thinking about, we're just given this information and we just learnt to do it. And because of sometimes our own personal experiences, you start to realize, hey, this doesn't fit with what I know to be true. And I think, you know, what you were just saying then about using this in your work, this kind of taps into one of the questions I wanted to ask. What has been the impact of this paper, and what feedback have you received from others? Because that was really interesting what you were starting to say about how some people are finding it almost too challenging and others are in a position to adopt the ideas in there. Yeah, so what have you heard from others about the paper?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So it's interesting. I've received, you know, we put out our work, you know, our blood, sweat, and tears out there. And, you know, we know that we always, once it's out there, right? So you don't know what the impact is going to be once that pebble lands in the water. I've received a lot of, a number of emails from parents or caregivers of disabled children who said this was the first time that I understood how I could conceptualize the language or the languaging of my child. I received a lot of comments from disabled clinicians who are speech language therapists also, who say like, wow, this is the first time that I've seen anything like this. From colleagues who say that they have used it in their classes. I just did an invited lecture for the Council in Academic Programs in Communicative Sciences and Disorders, CAPSID, here. And there I mainly centered as, you know, using this framework, you know, of the critical stance, which involves both critical reflection and evaluation and critical literacy. Through the loop that you're talking about, the naming, the disrupting, the reframing, and the reflecting and acting. And I've used that now in my courses as sort of like a journey that we take. And so for me personally, not to center myself, but to center myself, it's this type of work is forever, is lifelong. But also in addition to that, I think what it's helped me realize is it's a way of engaging in a world that questions currently, or that is calling us to question what truth is, it is the roadmap or the compass that we need right now. And so for me, it's been impactful because I use it every day, right? For my students, it's been interesting because now they're applying them to, say, children's books that they may select. So like I have another paper that just came out this year with a group of my students and a couple of colleagues, where we used something similar to this paper, but applied to children's books, and sort of questioning what are the ideas about language that children's books that actually center language are giving to the kids that we're reading. And that models also a dialogue to engage with kids about that level of criticality. And so that's one thing. And then I'm also using it to like analyze artifacts that are used, like handouts or tests or things of the sort in the classroom itself. So it's become something that I carry with me everywhere. And then beyond that, I think, you know, the Informed SLP, I don't know if you follow their, they just did a little summary of this paper too, connected to also like selecting children's books, you know, in relation to that. So it's had some traction. I'm surprised in some ways because it was my, can I just give you another piece of like trivia? That was my very first authored journal paper I ever wrote.
Wow. Okay. So it is a very special paper.
It is very personal.
And so close to your heart too. It's a great topic to have that as your first authored paper is amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was just thinking through what you were talking about, children's books, and I think sometimes, like, and what I liked is because you gave examples, some of this doesn't need to be that hard. You know, I was just thinking, I was teaching a linguistics class where we were talking about sentence structures, and there was quite a diversity of people in the room from very different language backgrounds, speaking lots of languages. And I just said, we're talking about English today, but what happens in your languages? You know, and we talked about, because I know in Sinhala that the order of words is different and you don't mark gender with your pronouns. And so we had this amazing discussion with people from speaking lots of different languages, but also still focusing on what we were learning and the content. But it was, and I could see also how those students felt, being able to talk about and value their language. And so I think that's the thing. Sometimes these concepts feel really big, but there are little things that we can do to start changing the way we think. And so I really like how you've given us language to understand what it is we're doing and what stages we can go through.
And if I may add, the other piece about this, some of the time, you know, we in the rush after 2020 to repurpose the language that we used, right? You think about terms like culturally responsiveness. Do we really know that cultural responsiveness is actually a way of being? It is like a pedagogical orientation, right? But it's a way of being that actually must center criticality. If it doesn't, then we are not doing cultural responsiveness. You know, cultural responsiveness. And so I feel like in some ways that the other piece about this that I keep teaching my students, or I keep, you know, talking about it, or kind of like even thinking, repurposing my own way of conceptualizing, is that we cannot do culturally responsiveness in speech language pathology without criticality about language. Okay, so it even moves beyond the notion of like affirming languages. That's one level of it, but it's really engaging in like, okay, say for example, the studies that we have been fed that state that certain groups are not, you know, developing vocabulary because they're exposed to multiple languages at the same speed. Or people who say that, you know, there's certain gaps in language for certain populations. And we know that they have come under, you know, scrutiny as of late. But I think really thinking about it from the standpoint of centering that critical language stance, we can say, okay, those data are here. These people came up with those, you know, ideas They pursued them. Sometimes they checked themselves in their positionalities, other times they didn't. Those data are here. I'm not saying you need to say that is wrong and this is what's right, but I'm saying that can we engage in questioning what is there now, which is like what we did in that paper, right? Like we took even something simple as a handy handout from one of the most commonly used website tools here in the United States, the Super Duper, and we can analyze like, oh, we can have a handout that you would give to a family member or to a caregiver that says, if your child has developed X many words, do we ever question where those percentages come from? Who was sampled? Who's left out? Like even that. And then do we ever wonder ourselves, like I often hear my students, and I used to do this, talk about that the language of the home is so much less complex than the language of schooling. Who says that? What is complexity? Who devises the notion of complexity that we ascribe to? And how are we positioning ourselves in the languaging of our ancestors and the funds of knowledge that we have in our homes whenever we say that that's less complex than whatever we do in schooling? Like, that's what I mean. Yeah, those beliefs have impact in the end.
Yeah, and thinking about language is multifaceted, and just starting to think is basically what you're saying is, just don't accept everything unquestioningly, because there's so many things we come across, and proficiency is one of them for me, because if you approach it from that sort of lens of I only speak one language and I'm proficient in it, but when you speak multiple languages and across different modalities, and you may not be literate in the language, but you speak it and you only, you use it for particular vocabulary that you can't express in the other language, it's much more nuanced than just proficient or not proficient. And that can sometimes only become apparent when you look at it across more than one language. So yes, just that sort of thinking without just unquestioningly accepting everything. So my next question, I think you've sort of started to answer this through your responses to the other questions, but what were your own biggest learnings from this work? If there is anything else that you wanted to add, because I think you have already spoken about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is once, not to quote, but to quote Du Bois, once you lift the veil, there's no way that veil is going down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, first of all, it's important to know once that veil is lifted, it's not going down again, which means you're never going to be necessarily not curious or not skeptical about what you're reading or seeing. And you're able to see even more. It reminds me a lot of like when I learned photography. So I'm a photographer. I was a photographer with a business for like 15 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But that's a way of languaging and engaging with the world too, is a way of playing observation, right? And so once you learn to look through your lens, your way of engaging with your immediate environment around you changes. You cannot unsee outside of that lens anymore. Like you will always look at the environment, the subjects of interest. Yes, it's focused attention, right? And you leave a lot out, but we do the same thing with knowledge. So we cannot be, so the other piece about this is that it's never going to be perfect, and we have to be okay with that imperfection, and it's never going to be complete, and we have to be okay with the incompleteness in learning. And that's the piece which I think you alluded to. So that's one thing that I feel that has really, as a person who's an academic, as a woman of color in the academy, I was just talking about this with a former doc student of mine, who's now faculty, like how much pressure we as people of color sometimes are put under in the academy, and how expectations are so much higher, both from people who may share our positionalities and people who may not share our positionalities. So to be okay with that, with the rawness of like the sort of the wean evolution, the goo inside the chrysalis. And I think this work is teaching me to be that way. And it's almost like it's the peeling of the layers of colonization to some extent. And in some ways it's healing. So I think a lot about the process of how did I describe myself, my bilingualism, my languaging, and I do use the ing, and I explained what I think I did a better job in the most recent paper explaining it. I'm
Okay.
still kind of like evolving with it.
Okay.
And again, that's part of this. Like, I'm not going to be perfect with it, right? But this notion that languaging is not, it's part of who we are. That language is not the thought bubble that has the surface and the deep, content and form and use. It's that, but is that coming from an external perspective? It is also the way that I, say I love you. It is also the way that I feel that I love, so there's a lot there that sometimes we don't encompass because research makes us be a lot more measured and standardized and boxed in. So how can you unbox yourself? And to me, that's what this work has done. It's like sort of like unleashed a part of me that has become much more curious about the ways. And then, and then it invites me into like, think about, okay, well, if we're thinking about languaging as something that is in our bodies, one, something that is never going to be stable and perfect, right? Two, which means it's dynamic.
Yeah.
But also something that is co-constructed, that whatever I'm saying now has meaning to you, but it may have very different meaning to somebody else who's listening now, because that meaning is not this notion that I have a meaning and I'm going to share it with you and then you're going to receive the meaning that I intended, and if not, then there's going to be the feedback loop. Okay, there is that lens for that, but it's so much more than that. Like I evoke feelings when I talk. Sometimes there may be feelings that you associate with something that was positive. Sometimes there might be discomfort. That is languaging too. And so to me, it's broadened that, which then invites me to think, okay, so then if that's how I'm defining language and languaging, how am I defining linearity in language? Who fits and who doesn't fit? If what I say you don't understand, okay, again, bringing in non-speakerism, for example, a person who's non-speaking. If what I say you don't understand, is it really not language? Or is it just my meaning-making mechanism and your repertoire are not quite in partnership at that point? Okay, and I think that can like really explode the possibilities. And I mean like explode, I know like I'm using like a word language, but expand, let's say, our possibility of becoming in speech language pathology. And I just wish there was more of that interest in that direction, which is why art has become like a really big thing for me, because I think it creates that space too.
Yeah. And I think, what you're saying is just this opening up. Like, so what you're describing what you went through, but it's also what the paper is telling us to do, is to be open to the idea of what languaging actually is. And I like that you said we don't have to throw out all this other knowledge that we have, but be open to thinking beyond that and what else there might be, and critically thinking about, and also the impact of not being open to other perspectives and other things, what that might be doing. And I think also when you say being uncomfortable with the discomfort, there's so much of that that's important with a lot of work that's happening in different areas now. You have to learn to know, that it's okay that you don't understand everything all at once, that you don't have your head around all of these things at once, but that you're trying to understand. You may be trying to be more critical about what you and your field and your colleagues are doing, and being open to learning, I think. So that, the learning, because we're so used to just having, well, as students, you have this information fed to you and then, that's what I do, and I'll go and do unquestioningly. So learning to question and be okay with not having all the answers at once. I think that's a big part of this process too. The final thing I wanted to ask you, because there'll be people that we will meet and talk about the paper, but there'll be others who might read this paper and not be able to attend the meeting because it's at 3 a.m. for them. But what would you like readers to take away from this paper?
I think, one, this willingness to engage in opening up making the little box that we go around with, that is like a little treasure box of knowledge, right, that we accrue. Just open it up just a little bit and let it pour in. Let it see what it stirs. Let us see what kind of necklace it creates whenever you add a pearl from this sort of perspective. But the other piece about it, which I think is really crucial, that academia sort of eradicates in a lot of us, is none of this work is done alone.
Yeah.
The paper came about and the journey came about because I was in the company of someone else having a dialogue. Dialogues are crucial. They're becoming harder to have because we are finding ourselves in opposition with each other. And we're often in that space of trying to convince one another that we are the ones that are right. That is not what this is about. That reflection and action is praxis. It's something that you're always going to be circling down. And I think circling through. And I think the other piece about it is how important it is to just breathe. We kind of started off camera talking about meditation and sort of our ways of connecting and grounding, right? And in some ways that compass invites you to ground, and to ground also in what is your knowledge, but not just your knowledge that comes from books. What has your life experience been like? That is often considered biased, not objective, but it is knowledge in our bodies. It is wisdom in our bodies. Our ancestors knew that those wisdoms were always in consonance with the land, were always in relationship and flow. So to have an opportunity, that's a gift I've given to myself, okay, through this. And you talk about like, what is the biggest thing? Maybe that it is precisely that, is the coming in touch, the acknowledgement, the honoring of those who came before me, what their lessons have been, and of my own self, both little Maria Rosa, that was very little in another country, the lessons that I've learned about my language over the course of time, and then who I am becoming, because it's always ing, we're never done. Okay, until maybe we take our last breath, and then we could claim that there's energy after that too, right? So there's a lot of that to me has been very spiritual, but I would move us back to how can we have the dialogue and how can we have the journey with each other. And I'm going to finish with this. In my language and in my culture and in my family, when I talk about culture, I talk about my family, not so much the Dominican culture, although it's very present in the Dominican culture. We use the word acompañamiento. Acompañar means to accompany to some extent, but it is bigger than that. It is really a moving with. It is a moving with, and not necessarily just there superficially to take up space. It is a spiritual grounding. And I feel like that's what went into that paper that was represented, both through the pictures, through the dialogue, through the examples, through my friendship with Clara, that I hope that people can take away from that, is that grounding in dialogue and acompañamiento, and that we may do that with our learning and with each other.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really nice, and I think also in the paper, I really loved that you finished with the idea of, well, what will this all achieve? You know, like that raising of critical consciousness, and that is together acting collectively is how we can bring about that change within the institutions that we work in. And I like that it gives us that pathway forward, and that is based on this idea of dialogue and having conversations and learning with and from each other, and not being scared to do that. I think that's the thing I often think about, is how do we encourage people that it's okay to start unpacking things that they may have been living with all this time unquestioningly. So
yeah, and I mean, I think, Sam, also the piece about that is that in some parts of the world, some of those conversations are censored as well. And so we are living with a reality. We are living in a reality that is very different from maybe when that paper was written even. where there was this like swelling up of like, let's do this thing. So I think now I'm really interested. I'll just like to drop another thing that maybe the readers might be interested in. I can give you some literature on it. Ethnodrama. It's called ethnodrama, and also interview theater, because it lends itself to having these conversations and weaving the stories without impacting, without the power of the directionality of the ideas. You know, it's like you collect interviews. That's one way of doing it. Collect interviews, take up the excerpts of the interviews that have been collected, and then you have artists who are going to be the actors in these exchanges that are not necessarily talking at each other. They're just, it's like bubbles of speech that are in language that are put out. But in that, there's also engagement with the audience that may be present in those spaces. And I do think that there's something there that can be garnered important for us as speech language pathologists, having these dialogues when we feel like our emotions are swelling up, right? Not to necessarily completely erase emotion, because I think emotion is part of who we are too, is energy, right? But I think in that space of being able to have a productive learning to take away from that space. So that's the next. I think that's what I'm leading to. Like I'm into that. I'm going into that now, collaborating with a couple of people. So that
that sounds really creative. I love it. So I will stop our interview now. Thank you so much, Maria. Just like the paper, I think I'm going to have to listen back to our conversation and absorb it. But I really love that. Yeah, there's so much food for thought in what you've written about, but also what we've spoken about. And I'm also so pleased that, you know, we are living at a time where we can have these conversations and we can see these changes occurring, because at the beginning of my studies as a speech pathology student, I certainly didn't even know that there was the need to have these conversations, but wouldn't have anticipated that, you know, we are seeing lots of interrogation of our own thinking and ways of doing things now. So that's a really positive move forward, I think. So thank you so much for the paper and for the conversation today.
Thank you for having an interest in it. So